This is from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 to 47, and it's from the First Nations translation, which is not one, thank you, Nancy, and was not a translation that I had been aware of. And I'm really grateful that we're using that today, and I want to be adding that to my resources. And as we go through, it will come to point verse 33 where it uses the name Creator Sets Free. And that's the First Nations translation for a term for Jesus. Creator sets free. Acts 2, 42 to 47, a new family is formed. This newly formed family continued daily to learn from the 12 message bearers. They lived together in harmony, ate ceremonial meals, and prayed with one another. Great respect and awe came down upon all, and the message bearers performed many wonderful signs. As these new followers lived together in peace, their harmony grew stronger, and they shared all things. Many of them had a giveaway to provide for all who were in need. Each day they gathered at the sacred lodge. With good and pure hearts, they feasted together in their homes and shared the ceremonial meal of fry bread and wine given to them by Creator Sets Free. They gave honor and thanks to the Great Spirit and were respected by the people. Each day, Creator sent more people who were being set free to join with them. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Continuing with Revelation chapter 6, verse 9 through 11. When the Lamb broke open the fifth seal, I looked under the sacred altar and saw the souls of the ones who had been killed for remaining true to the message Creator had given them. They cried out in a loud voice, "O honored one, who is holy and true? How long will it be before you right the wrong done against us by the people of the land who have shed our blood?" Then each of them was gifted with white regalia and told to rest for the little while longer. For these were still a number of their brothers and sisters who also served the Great Spirit, who must be killed in the same manner they were. Revelation 7:9. After this, I saw a great crowd of people, too many to count, from every nation, tribe, clan, and language. They were standing before the seat of honor, before the Lamb, dressed in pure white regalia, holding palm tree branches in their hands. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I am honored to read the introduction for our speaker today. I was told that I had the ability to shorten her intro, but I could not figure a way of doing it without honoring all of her accomplishments. So bear with me, and I will read quickly, and if I miss anything, you will hear it and see it in the way that she brings us her presentation. So, Nancy S. Gillis was the executive director of the John Nehart State Historic Site and the Institute for Vision and Learning for 19 years. Retired in 2019, she brought to that entity a background of both education and corporate administration. Now on its board of directors, she still speaks on Nehart's work and the wide variety of related topics. She spent 30 plus years in education, including on faculty at Wayne State College, Northwest Community College, Nebraska Indian Community College, and Little Priest Tribal College. teaching Native American history and cultures, U.S. history, world history, cultural anthropology, and sociology, and an honors course in John G. Nehart, a popular presenter on humanities, Nebraska Speaker Bureau. She gives talks on such topics as Nehart and Black Elk, Native American women's auditory impact of 1860s, legislation on the Plains Tribal, Dr. Susan La Flèche, I'm not pronouncing that right, Picot, the 5 tribes of Nebraska, and many others, including workshops on Native stereotyping in curriculum materials and teaching about Native Americans for education in service programs. Of Cherokee and Choctaw descent, Ms. Gillis is originally from California, but lived in several states before coming to Nebraska in 1987 to work with the Winnebago tribe for the Reformed Church in America. In 2014, she received the Addison Sheldon Award for the state of Nebraska for, for distinguishing service of history of Nebraska in the stories of Native Americans and writings of John Nehart. For 2012, is commissioned Admiral of the Great Navy of Nebraska by Governor Heisman, and in 2021, named to the Nehart Foundation Wall of Fame. In 1990, she traveled to Guatemala with the Central for Global Education as an observer, reporting on social and economical conditions amongst indigenous people. In 2001, received a fellowship from the Smithsonian for Diversity Leadership in Museums in Washington, D.C., and in 2007, presented a paper on Nehart in the 20th Annual Gerard Manley Hopkins Conference in Ireland. Ms. Gillis also helps train descents of Nebraska's History Museum in Lincoln and has served on the Nebraskan State Poet Advisory Board as a counselor for the Nebraskan Indian Commission Sovereign Youth Leadership Camp, provides leadership for college-bound AP exams and world history, an auditor of AP teaching. Sibley was was a consultant / instructor for 3 years, training American History Native Grant Awards, and served on the board of the Nebraska Folk Life Network, the Nebraska State Historic Preservation Board, the Nebraska Arts Council, Multicultural Grant Panel, renewed to 2004 Nebraska Adventure Textbook, reviewing many textbooks for Nebraska Historical Society magazine, and editor of the Nehart Journal, and served in the 2024 State Poet Committee. Lastly, she serves on the RCA Native American Indigenous Ministry Council and its commission for nominations, as well as the West Sioux Classes Seminary Student Care Team, and the member of the Dismantling Racism Gathering as a worship coordinator and occasional pulpit supply. Besides the Nehart Foundation, she also serves on the board of Dr. Susan La Flèche Picot Hospital Center, at last of Winnebago, and the elder of the Winnebago Reformed Church at the Wathill Village Planning Committee. She is a proud grandmother of 4, great-grandmother of 9, enjoys traveling, participating in powwows, gardening, reading, and collecting Native American art, particularly stereotypical images of Native Americans she used in programs on this topic. As you see, I could not shorten this because it is so rich with her accomplishments and all that she does. And I know she's blushing right now because most times we can't live up to our description. So I'm excited and just honored to bring to you Nancy Gillis, who will now share what's on her heart with us.
Otsio negada, sunali osta, ulanuhi nuatu iadu, chichalagi, chi anuwodi, chinotanahne dagwadoa. I've introduced myself and greeted you in the language I heard my great-grandmother speaking at home, the Chalagi or Cherokee language. And what I did was I greeted you, and then I called on the Creator to be present so that everything that's said and done here is done in a good manner. Then I told you what tribe I belonged to and then what clan I belonged to. Only then did I give you my name. For traditional people and traditional gatherings, that's the correct order of things for most tribes. Thank you for inviting me to share in this safe space. And hopefully we can gain encouragement and to tackle the myriad forms of separation we have created as human beings. A separation that was constructed by us, not a thing of God, but it is through God's help and each other's support that we can overcome and maybe erase. And I want to state that I don't attempt to speak for all Native people. That's not my right. I can only speak from my personal knowledge and experience, and hopefully inspire a desire to learn more and to understand. So I'm of mixed heritage. I'm Cherokee and Choctaw, Scots, Irish, French, and English. And some of you have known me for years, and I did have black hair at one time, but Mother Nature did this. And then I have a fair complexion. I have green eyes of my European ancestors, but I was raised in two worlds, that of Cherokee traditions and a Western education. Both Protestant Christian home, but where all the ceremonies of our Cherokee culture were kept. And as I said, the language was spoken. A sense of difference was introduced to me very early. My appearance was from the roll of the genetic dice for people who are of mixed race. As one of the lightest in the family, I usually passed as all white because it was easier than trying to explain my family. With some non-natives, I've been too Indian in my lifestyle and outlook for them to be comfortable. Yet to some other Native people, I'm not Indian enough. And I was told in third grade in the Los Angeles school system that I couldn't be Indian because I didn't look Indian. And I knew very well I didn't look much like my family. My parents, my dad had coal black hair and black eyes. My mother looked more Hispanic. And my maternal grandparents who raised me, my grandfather had very dark skin and hair and eyes, but my grandmother was fair and blonde with blue eyes. And I had a great-grandmother with brown hair and eyes who still spoke the language fluently, and another great-grandmother who was blonde and blue-eyed. I was also told in school, you can't be Indian, there are no Indians left. And I went home to a whole house full of them. So I grew up very early knowing that there was a lot of ignorance out there. And as I said many times, it was easier for me to not try to correct people, not confront them, and just let it go. And there were times in the family and traveling from Los Angeles to Arkansas for green corn ceremony and those kinds of things with my grandparents, where when my grandfather would stop for gas, I would be sent in to pay for the gas, because in the window of many of those Oklahoma and Texas gas stations were signs that said no dogs or Indians allowed. So I was the one that paid for the gas, and that's just how I grew up, with a foot in each of two worlds. My great-grandmother said, "You will wear two dresses." And as I've gotten older, I've realized exactly what she meant. Our personal identities are complex. I serve as an educational director and presenter for the Nebraska Humanities Council, and I'm often, after giving a presentation on the tribes of Nebraska or some other program, I'm approached by someone proudly telling me that they had a great-great-great-grandmother who was maybe a Cherokee princess, or she might have been Sioux, or even just she was Indian. And even if DNA test results say that there's a percentage of native blood, that doesn't equate with kinship with native communities. Because there's a big difference between a distant native ancestry and living the way native people have lived and are still living today. A difference between being distantly related versus thoughtfully taking up responsibility for one another within native communities, especially for those people who live in areas that are surrounded by towns named after native tribes or specific native people, and have no idea who those people were or where they went. And some of these same people I've found are fully, even if unconsciously, involved in the erasing of the cultural and spiritual identities of our people. But being also of European ancestry, I live in another tension. I still need to be proud of the brave and hardy people who faced many dangers settling in the mountains of the Carolinas and Georgia. I can't and won't deny them. Yet, as a historian, I also understand their part in the theft, the oppression, and the genocide of Native people. And so I find myself in what in anthropology we call a bicultural bind. There's a lot of emotional tension there, a lot of questioning self-identity. And sometimes finding confrontation in people approaching me. Well, I had nothing to do with what happened to Native people. My family didn't immigrate here until, the 1920s or the 1890s. We didn't have anything to do with it. And trying to get people to understand that our very lifestyles, the way we live today, Native people included, is a direct result of this history. So sometimes different parts of our identities conflict. My identity as a Christian and a Native person is also a point of tension when we consider the history of the church with Native people. I refer to the church as a whole, not talking about any specific denomination. And excuse me if I'm a little gravelly. It's been very dry and very windy here in Nebraska lately, and so we're all experiencing a little bit of allergies. Each denomination has its own history with Native people. And for the early missionaries, they often lacked understanding of cultures that were radically different from their own. And so they then added to their sense of superiority their own culture and beliefs as a hierarchy. And so that precluded them trying to understand anything else. The history of forced and coerced conversions, imposed beliefs and values under various threats, the threat of the loss of land, the loss of children, removal from homelands, starvation, torture, even death, begs the question of whether Native peoples fully embraced the Christian doctrines or only gave lip service as a survival tactic. And there are many incidences of that, and not just with Native people here, but with Indigenous people all over the world. Some of that same thing has happened. And even today, the generational trauma is apparent in the high level of addictions, unemployment, single parent families, suicides, violence. And for our purposes here, the fact of the disinterest in being part of the church in a larger community or even on the reservation. And perhaps the most fearful aspect of our church's history is the extent that it's a history of good intentions, but not understanding the damages that were being done in its wake. Now, as a historian, I can't let you get away without a history lesson. It's got to be done. So, because I believe that the historic context is important to understanding, because most people have had little to no Native history in school beyond early contact events, the early colonialism. And spending 35 years teaching college courses, courses which, as I said, sometimes get pushback from students, depending on their own backgrounds. And the majority of my students were either white or black because of where I live and the colleges I taught in. And certainly Native people do not corner the market on suffering in this nation's history, either in the past or the present. But the difference in our stories has to do with the original desire of the colonizers, the very land we stand on. That's what was wanted from us, and that's what would be taken in any way possible. To obtain the land, the policies were threefold. Assimilate them. That meant to Christianize and civilize them, to make them like whites in their lifestyle, beliefs and values, economic and social, or move them out of the way, often forced into lands already occupied by other tribes. Barring that, the third policy was extermination. So to give just a brief history, which is hard to do when you're talking about 500 years, but from early contact through the 1820s, there were massacres, definitely, but the policy of the US government was assimilation to gain millions of acres of land. And that had been the policy of the British and the French also. And then when we get the 1830s, we have Andrew Jackson. And his government policy was removal, move them out of the way. So all tribes east of the Mississippi, from Maine to Key West, were forcibly moved to west of the Missouri River. And that meant forcefully removed by the military and becoming refugees in their own land. Nearly every one of the over 1,000 tribes in what became the United States were subjected to this atrocity. It's a refugee situation in our history, because when you remove people that way forcibly, the first people to die are your elderly. So your sense of connectedness, your language, your spiritual beliefs, um, your origin mythologies, um, every sense of who you are, who's related to whom, those are the people who have that knowledge. The next group to die will be infants and nursing and pregnant mothers. That's your sense of future. Why? What else is there to live for but those children and the coming grandchildren and so forth, your legacy? So the legacy has been destroyed. And that left a core of adults in survival mode under conditions relative to being treated as livestock, herded together, often stockaded. For the Cherokee, 18,000 began the trip in 1836 on foot over 1,000 miles during that winter and lost more than 4,000 along the way, only to be placed on lands taken from other tribes where there was no more game, no grazing, no arable land, no stocks of food provisions, no medical care, and not allowed to leave. And the story is repeated over and over. As I said, over 1,000 tribes went through this. I've lived with the Winnebago people, or Ho-Chunk Nation of Nebraska now, for 38 years. They were moved like this 5 times in 28 years, from Wisconsin to Iowa to Minnesota to South Dakota, before eventually ending up in Nebraska, settling on land belonging to the Omaha Nation. When we get to the 1860s and the era of the Civil War, government policy became one of focused extermination. Just prior to and during the Civil War and just after, U.S. military troops were sent to Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Nebraska, and South Dakota with orders, as well documented, orders to exterminate, to attack camps and villages and kill all who refused to be placed on reservations. The massacres of men, women, and children, because the battle was brought to them, to their homeland. Blue Water, Nebraska in 1854, on through Sand Creek, Colorado in 1865, clear until 1890 at Wounded Knee, South Dakota. Those who did move on to the reservations were restricted in movement, in occupation, in use of their land, any individual autonomy, any tribal autonomy. Their lives were ruled by the government agents and the military. And on the plains in particular, early contact with the Catholic Church through religious orders like the Jesuits, the Benedictines, and the Augustines. But the Protestant missions then began moving onto the reservations, causing conflicts between denominations. It was like everybody was coming in to convert the natives as the Great Plains opened up. So President Grant in 1871, called his peace policy, instituted a lottery wherein all the Protestant denominations were assigned a specific tribe and told to open churches and schools and convert the tribal members. Now, what Grant aimed to do was replace corrupt government agents with missionaries he believed were morally better suited. But they also were given the authority to control the distribution of food, to remove children, some for adoption to white families back east, or to farmers and ranchers as a labor force, and determine the competency of adults. The 1880s bring the boarding schools, where children as young as 4, including one of my adopted brothers, were transported several hundred miles from their family, most never to see those families again. They were punished for speaking their native language. No ceremonies or any cultural content were allowed or even talked about. The schooling was in the trades, harness making for boys and domestic science for girls, the most rudimentary 3 R's. The schools had to be self-sustaining, so all the work was done by the students, and skills that were taught were no longer needed in the growing cities of the 20th century. When we get to the 20th century, are some of the issues we are still dealing with today. We experience the non-consensual sterilization of Native American women into the 1970s. Commitment to asylums as incompetent for those who were alcoholics or had an addiction or had committed petty crimes. High incarceration among Native American males. The highest homicide rate in this nation is against Native women. The highest missing person rate is among Native Americans. In the 1960s, our Canadian relatives to the north, the government instituted what we call the 60s scoop, which forcibly removed children from homes that had no indoor plumbing as being they were unfit parents. Parents who refused to comply were beaten and incarcerated, and the children were adopted to white families in both Canada and America. So these are among some of the issues created in this intergenerational trauma soup, as I call it, that so many of our Native people carry with them. Now, simply engaging in missionary or government bashing is to miss the point and is way too narrow. And that's not what I intend to do here. Our spiritual traditions are still rooted in cultural contexts that are still quite foreign to the dominant society. So they can only understand at a surface level when they hold Indian practices and beliefs up to their own experiences and beliefs. So Native people do need the church today more than ever. What we need is not a church telling us it knows what's best for us, inviting itself in to kind of mine traditional ways for things to cobble together to show a semblance of understanding. I was very glad to, a few years ago, run across this First Nations translation. But in some ways, it's a kind of lip service, because is it being used anywhere? You know, it may be used in a few Native churches, but is it being used anywhere else? I've been in churches, particularly Catholic churches, to where they use sage or cedar as incense, and they'll use eagle feathers to move the incense through the room. They'll do some of those types of things to acknowledge Native culture, but it's almost an appropriation if there's not Native people in the congregation who have asked for that crossover to be done. What we need is the church as an ally who will join us in the continuing imperialism, colonialism that we fight in the courts and on the streets. The church can help. Other organizations, not necessarily Christian organizations, a lot of secular organizations are stepping up. We need an ally who will join us in finding our children that were illegally taken from us, finding our murdered and missing relatives, help us resist the destruction of our sacred sites, including our natural resources, our water resources. We need help in confronting our government to fulfill its obligations, both under treaties established long ago, as well as recognize us, our citizenship, our contributions to this country today and for the future. It wasn't until 1879 when a judge in Nebraska ruled we were, quote, persons under the law, the same as resident aliens, naturalized citizens, sojourners, and freed slaves. But it wasn't until 1924 the government decided we were citizens. And, to be declared citizens by the government on our own native land. It was 1978 before our religious freedoms were protected by law. We could not celebrate certain ceremonies. We could be arrested for going to Sundance. We could be arrested for those Native people who used peyote as their sacrament within their ceremonies. It was 1989 before our graves were protected. It was not illegal for someone to just dig up a Native American gravesite and take the goods out and sell them to a museum. That's where the Smithsonian got most of its goods. But after 1989, NAGPRA now requires museums, if they can identify what tribe those goods came from, to return them to the tribe for reburial. Jim Crow included Native Americans, and a lot of people don't know that in the South, all of the Jim Crow restrictions applied to Native Americans. Miscegenation was Native and white as well as black and white, and was against the law. Yet Native people had been enlisting in the U.S. military since the American Revolution and all wars since, even when they weren't citizens and didn't have the vote. Protecting our homelands, even when the rest of the nation wanted us exterminated. So the church and Native communities, whether reservation or urban, have unfinished business handed down from our ancestors, trickling down to generations twice, even 3 times removed. The church's actions today can help to correct the mistakes of the past. Even if there's no absolution to be had, an understanding is what's needed that may help keep the same mistakes from being repeated. Native people have always been here on what we call Turtle Island. We didn't die out like the old movies show. Our cultures didn't disappear despite the abuses and massacres. For a history class, I counted up the massacres and came up with 221 named massacres of Native people. Between 1800 and 1890, in less than 100 years, 58% of the Native population was killed. 350,000 people in less than 100 years were killed by military and other actions. We're at 3.5 million today. In 1900, there were just under 280,000 Native people left alive in the United States. We're at 3.5 million now, but we're still just 1% of the population. We're still struggling to survive and protect the land, like at Standing Rock, South Dakota, where the battle is to prevent the Dakota pipeline from ruining our water supply. And we're still there, even though the crowds in the media have left. There's still Native people protesting there. Here In Nebraska, we walk each November for our missing children. We walk for our missing relatives. We vote. We create programs to battle our people's addictions, our families' rights, recognizing our unique needs culturally, economically, politically, is what we need from the churches as a whole, as well as the good news of the gospel. It has to go hand in hand. And we invite our non-native friends to join us in fighting for these things, to learn the joint history, to understand the whys of the resentments and the standing off away from Christian churches that so many Native people do. It's also been a struggle to get Native people to embrace Western education due to past abuses, as well as us being left out of the curriculum, except for those, early colonial events. Thankfully, this is changing slowly. We have tribal colleges who adjust the curriculum and the requirements to our settings. And we have a lot of success stories. We have attorneys, we have journalists, we have doctors, we have senators, we have actors and writers. We even have a Native astronaut. And in Nebraska, we have a Lakota senator, Tom Brewer. We have Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who's a Ponca woman. For the United States, the first Native American to hold a government office at this level, U.S. Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, is a Laguna Pueblo. So I feel now that it's time for the church to not look at us to convert to civilize or civilize to convert, but recognize our individual agency and that our concepts of spiritual life is fully integrated into ourselves and our cultures. Native people do not separate out body, mind, and soul as Western philosophy does. And the church to recognize the need to walk alongside of us as we find our way to discovering God's grace for ourselves and our people. And to finish, there's very good news for the RCA, at least, when in 2024 at General Synod, Native American Indigenous Ministries Council was reinstated after having disbanded by the denomination about 10 years ago as unnecessary. So we fought, and my dear brother George Martineri was part of it. We fought to be reinstated, be brought back in as one of the ethnic councils of the RCA. And we're small. We consist of 6 churches, 1 in Nebraska, 1 in Canada, 2 in Oklahoma, and 2 in New Mexico. And they're small congregations in poverty line communities. But we've endured. The RCA has been in Winnebago since 1907, Lawton, Oklahoma since 1901, where the great warrior Geronimo joined in baptism in 1902. So the church has a lot of work to do. We as fellow Christians have a lot of work to do for each other and with each other. And that may begin with the complete acceptance of Native Christians and non-Christians as viable children of God who need Jesus, but need him the way we see him and relate to him, not just the way the dominant society says we should. So in my Tsalagi language, I say, Wado, thank you for your kind attention to my personal take on our desire to dismantle racism in our particular context. Thank you so much. Bless you all.